Welcome everybody. How's it going? Hope you're well wherever you are at. David here with this week's Griscom stream. Happy to take your questions, comments, whatever's on your mind. We have had a lot of really fun stuff on the channel lately. Be sure to check it out. We released our conversation with Matt McManus, breaking down James Lindsay, everyone's least favorite axe dancing anti-Marxist. His very strange book called Race Marxism. You can find that on our YouTube channel. We crossed over 20,000 subscribers too, so thanks everybody so much, especially our new subscribers. Welcome to the channel. These are a lot more casual streams, just sort of hanging out, taking people's questions, things like that. Also, if y'all didn't see it, I also think we did a pretty damn good job breaking down that Applebee's email and taking a little bit past just these owners of these kind of franchises are assholes, and helping us understand, some of the key tenets of Marxism laid out in Capital Volume 1. So also check that out too if you haven't seen it. But welcome everyone. We checking the chat for everyone's questions. I'm going to try to keep it a little tight today because I got to run a little bit to interview our guest for tomorrow's show. We have Big Waz on, a good friend of ours, and as people know, TMBS Forever crew, Wozni Lombre. Really going to be looking forward to that. We're going to be talking about what they're calling in the NBA, this new era of players empowerment, and seeing just how far that goes, and sort of breaking down some of the hurdles that people in the NBA are facing, and sort of maybe some ways to think about a different kind of model. But let's get going. I'll be happy to take some questions. Let me see if anyone's got any. If not, I could get into a couple stories. Delusional bad Lacan. Man, you got a lot of stuff going on there. That discussion with Matt McManus was legendary. These whack job mathematician theorists are insane. You know what's so funny about this, and maybe I need to stop getting upset with it. Maybe I'm too earnest, but like, I see the James Lindsay people, they'll show up in our comment section every once in a while, and they're always like, "Well, you didn't actually engage with any of James's arguments. You were just making fun of him." And blah, blah, blah. I don't know. At this point, we've done, in my opinion, almost too much stuff on him. I know it's entertaining and funny, but I try not to do too much like YouTube personality stuff on this program. But there's a part of me that, like, whenever I get those kind of criticisms, it really frustrates me, because I'd be fine if people were saying something like, "We're not convinced by your arguments," or things like that. But at this point, I mean, we've probably dedicated at least 3 hours of showtime between that and a few other segments that we've done to his books and to his arguments. And I frankly, I don't know what more we can do, especially when we've established time after time that he misunderstands Marx from the get-go, specifically by tying it into traditions that are founded in a kind of opposition to a totally materialist understanding of history, right? Which is one of the key tenets of Marxism as a philosophy. James's kind of definition of what Marxism is there's a good side and a bad side, and any group and any kind of philosophy that does that is Gnostic, and Marxism is a kind of atheist Gnosticism. I don't know. I mean, it's ridiculous on its face, but I mean, I'm very happy to try to like take some time to debunk these arguments, but sort of realize after a little while that there's very, very little you can do for those folks. But definitely check out, and Matt McManus did us all a big favor by combing through the book. Matt and I read a good bit of it too before we did the show on it. But I always appreciate having our friends who are willing to take those deep dives into right-wing thinkers. Because Lord, I got enough stuff to be sort of catching up on rather than reading whatever the new like top 10 conservative book is that you find at the airport bookstore. Let's see. Our comrade down under says, Radium Theater Production says, do you think Elon Musk being on Twitter's board will make it better or worse? I mean, I can't imagine how that's going to make it any better, right? I mean, Musk understands that this is a very important platform for his revenue. I mean, this is somebody who thrives off of speculation. And, remember that, even his car company, Tesla, is still very, very far away from even producing enough cars to be considered, I don't know. The evaluation for Tesla compared to other car manufacturers, which produce way, way more cars, and very likely probably more electric vehicles than Tesla ever has. Um, he really needs, to be able to hype up his products on Twitter. So, he's got the money to make sure that they don't stand in his way there. I mean, hell, we'll see what happens. I could imagine that, I don't like the current, structure of Twitter in terms of the ownership. But I can't imagine that people are too happy that I have to sit in a boardroom with Elon Musk. But it'll be interesting to see. Um, Follow up here. Um, well, Jordan says Elon's one of the most thin-skinned people in history. And Radium Theater Productions follow up there says, I mean, will being on the board put him under? I mean, he puts himself under the spotlight, so I don't find that to be, he's going to be getting too much extra. I think it's more that, he bought his way. He got himself into a situation where they have to pick up his phone when he calls and when he sort of wants things to be done a certain way. I mean, frankly, it is worrying in the sense that, um, as far as I know, most of the other people on the board aren't really active Twitter users beyond the sense of just sort of promotion for Twitter. Elon Musk is a troll um, uses the platform to harass people. I can't imagine that that's going to get much better, and I can't imagine that it's going to be good for people like myself. Though I don't do too much stuff like that on Twitter, who are critical of him. I mean, I think for all the people who sort of like to wax philosophically about how we're in a new era because of social media, which I think the jury's still very much out on that. There's some things you can certainly do, and obviously it's great, for people who aren't necessarily in the kind of typical mainstream streams of like the media to get notoriety and to introduce himself to a larger audience. But I think a lot of that stuff there's a lot of hype around it too. But yeah, I don't think it's going to be making things better. And I think, you should be worried if you are somebody who promotes, social media as a kind of like grand tool that we have for free speech. You should be worried about this, one of the wealthiest people on the planet buying access to it. It's something I don't think we have to tell our audience this too often. We're going to talk a lot about this tomorrow, but Amazon, they just released a bunch of words that they're censoring from their internal kind of employee chat app. And they include things like that you would expect, like union, but they also include things like exploitation or plantation, things like that, right? And the biggest threat to free speech in this country is certainly corporate power. And if you are a free speech advocate, you should be very, very worried about powerful, wealthy people putting themselves in a position where they can potentially be stifling, speech even more than it already is. Uh, Facebook's a nightmare right now. Our friends at Tribune magazine in the UK, they just had one of their articles. They were trying to promote it using the ad service that Facebook offers, and they wouldn't let them promote it because it's discriminatory against landlords, right? That just should scare you. I mean, that should scare you a lot more than the kind of typical things that people get worked up when they're talking about free speech. I mean, corporate control over that system is absolutely frightening. And, the Mustang is not an exception to that. It just is a kind of, a very literal embodiment of the kind of outsized power that you get when you have money. And again, as I say time and time again, extreme wealth is a threat to democracy because it allows people to have way more power unchecked than they should. And, we should take those kind of threats seriously. Connor GF says, how can we condense concepts like labor theory of value and alienation to digestible memes? I don't read books either. Well, I'm going to be honest. I don't. I find the memification of a lot of Marxist stuff. I mean, like beyond just like finding certain things funny as like an organizing tool. I think that there's a very, very limited um, use of it, mainly because when you're trying to condense something like that into like an easily digestible form, you can get people very confused very easily, and I see that a lot with Marx in particular. There's a lot of people who like to dress themselves up online as like the most serious Marxist, and what most people think like Marx is like the most crazy left wing radical guy, and certainly, I mean, he's a communist, but um, you know, he was also very, very critical of people that he considered to be, to his left in a utopian way. I mean, most of Marx's kind of political polemics are about critiquing a kind of, this is Lenin's terminology, but a kind of ultra leftist. And I think that, memes again can be, I mean, I'm not against them in a general sense, but I don't think that's a good way to do political education. I think finding ways to have accessible conversations. I mean, not to pat ourselves on the back too much. Like I think what we did with the Applebee's email last week was a good way that you can sort of take something concrete that people understand and give it a little bit of a sharper theoretical edge. But I do find sometimes, you cheapen the theory sometimes when you boil it down too much. And I think that that's an unfortunate thing to do with Marxism, because like Marxism is not like, it's not the gospel in the sense that like if you say you're a true believer then you're saved. Like that's not actually the goal. With so much of this theoretical work is about helping us understand the world around us so that we can change it. It's equipping us with analytical and theoretical tools that you can understand things beyond just how it makes you feel, or say, or even just general feelings of like I'm being oppressed, right? That's a starting point, but you need to understand why and how you are if you ever want to change it, or else you're very, very likely to reproduce that system. This is one of the things that becomes like a cornerstone of a lot of Marxist thought in like the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s, is that why is it that capitalism continues to reproduce itself in all of these different cultures, in all of these different historical forms, despite growing opposition and contradictions exposing themselves. And you have to start um, you have to move beyond just saying like, oh, well, this system is bad, and being able to point at that to understanding how it functions, or else you're very, very likely to reproduce those systems, even if you win. I did a video for Jacobin a while ago called "Political Theory is for Everybody," something like that, where I sort of talk about Fred Hampton's lessons on this. But I think you got to be a little careful. I think sometimes about condensing these things because people can understand them. I think that I really dislike. That kind of mentality that certain folks aren't going to be able to understand these kind of concepts. In fact, one of the earliest things that most successful Marxist and socialist movements in history have done has been mass political education, not to indoctrinate, but to arm ourselves so that one, you understand why we're doing the things that we're doing, and two, so that you don't create a situation where there's one group of people with knowledge. Contrary to what somebody like James Lindsay and all these other kind of like reactionary conservatives argue about Marxism, is that it's trying to create a hierarchical system, under like in a clandestine way. The most adamant Marxists out there are people who say, no, we need to be educating the people so that they can understand for themselves what's going on instead of us just trying to tell them. When you get into a position where you feel like you need to like oversimplify things, omit things, then you're not really doing, in my opinion, that kind of radical revolutionary work. Jules wants to ask me, what's your take on Chris Smalls throwing shade against AOC for not being supportive to their cause? To be fair, I think he's right. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and lecture anybody who just won a David versus Goliath unionization story about who they need to be praising, and who they should be attacking. I think it's very, very reasonable for Smalls to come out there and say that we invited this person to a rally. They didn't show up. They sort of canceled on us, and I think that's fair. I think that of course this is. It actually has been funny to watch because I think that people sometimes, especially people who consume a lot of this kind of progressive or socialist online media, really fall into the trap of thinking that politics is about like a kind of interpersonal war between different media figures, and that you can't be as farther away from the truth if you fall into that kind of trap of thinking. Undoubtedly, like there are people out there who want to use that soundbite to say, "Look, I was right about everything," and it's completely cynical when you see those people. And I think we can all recognize it for what it is, without falling into the trap of saying, "Oh, Chris Smalls was wrong to say that," or acting as if that wasn't truly genuine or he's been duped or something like that. No, you should be able to take that as a serious kind of issue with one AOC, but also the larger movement. I don't know what was going on inside of New York DSA. Um, at the moment, but obviously, there was a lot more support that could have been given. This program as well. I mean, we had Chris Smalls on TMBS after the fact, and we covered the Staten Island movement as it was going on, but we didn't, devote whole episodes to it or something like that. Like, I think that it's very fair for somebody in that position to say, "Hey, I think that this group of people could have done a hell of a lot more." And you're not going to sit here. You're not going to hear from me any kind of weak defenses of AOC in particular. Again, I think that there's a hyper focus on her from a certain group of people who I think mistake uh, the kind of direct avenues that we have to build power. And the most important one is that we're not organized and we're not the most powerful group that gets our phone calls picked up when we're trying to talk to elected officials. That doesn't let the elected officials off the hook, but it also says for us, if we want to do something different, if we want to change and increase our power, we do have to be a lot more focused on our ability to project power and to grow, rather than thinking, oh, well, the problem is that we just have like these kind of corrupt big figures. I've done a lot on AOC and where I think she sort of fits in to this movement. And I'm not going to rehash it all here unless people maybe ask more questions and want to get into it a little bit more. But, I will say that, it's not unreasonable to spend a lot of time looking at what she's doing in public. It's 100% correct to say, she is just one congressperson and all of that, but she is seen by many, many people to be the kind of leader of a kind of socialist, democratic socialist movement in this country. And you can say that's not true or not, but that is the kind of public general understanding of it. So I think us being able to, draw those lines and delineate where we think that she breaks from us, where we say that, like, look, there's a big gap between ourselves as like an organized left and her. I think that making those things clear to folks without getting into what I call like AOC derangement syndrome, where you think that the reason we don't have Medicare for all, or more radical politics available to us immediately right now is just because of AOC. I think that that's also a huge mistake, but I don't think it's unreasonable to spend some time criticizing them. And again, not to pat Matt and I too much, on the back too much, but I think that we do a pretty good job on this show of 100% being critical when we see, figures who are associated with their movements sort of stepping out and not being in line with what we believe, but also not falling into the trap of thinking that, if we just had more spirited elected representatives, that we'd be in a different situation. Like, we could have a complete firebrand, kind of Tea Party style, burn it all down, lefty in Congress right now, and I don't think that necessarily shifts the board too much. And I think that I think being honest about that will help you out a lot in your analysis. Um, David, since you talking about volume one, is there a section of the book that you find yourself returning to or thinking about often? I mean, I think what we're talking about with the reserve uh, army of labor, the industrial reserve army, is something that I think about a lot, because it really flips the script of one more like kind of conservative groups or people who like praise capitalism, but also liberals who might sort of argue that what we need is like a kinder or gentler capitalism, because in particular, I mean, one every fucking politician in this country is going to tell you that they're for jobs and they're for more jobs and they're for better jobs. Doesn't matter if they're a Democrat or Republican or a Green Party person or even a socialist. Where I think Marx's concept of the reserve army of labor is really important, is because it actually shows that there are bounds. There are bounds within the system to employment. There are bounds within the system to how well we all can be living. And in fact, capitalism purposefully creates idleness. Capitalism purposefully creates dispossession and poverty, because it's a necessary function of the coercion that is necessary for this system. And this is where you'll find a big difference between people who you might see in the kind of immediate horizon, who might seem to be very close. Actually, there being a wide gulf between them, because like a lot of progressive economists, they think that there is a way to sort of build a gentler, nicer version of capitalism. And I think the Marxist analysis that no, there might be moments in history where class contradictions, and the class struggle is in a position where working people can get tremendous amounts of gains, and those are beneficial. But those gains will always be rolled back. I mean, this is Rosa Luxemburg's really great insight as well, right? And it's one of the big kind of criticisms of a kind of more reformist avenue, to radically reform, changing the system. So I think that section in Capital is something that has, immediate political implications for people. But obviously, I think spending some time with that text is worthwhile. It really, I think it's fair to say that it's dense, but it's also, tremendously interesting because it really breaks down the kind of logic of the system that we're living in. And our friend from South Carolina, Strom McCallum, says, uh, messing around with Frizzell, says, if Elon has the money, they have the time, which is a good country song. Ekin Erkin says, my girlfriend, it's good to hear from you. My girlfriend is helping organize a union for her Starbucks, currently in the step of talking to people before the vote. So far, it's going quite well, front loading specific grievances. And then second, following this up, Ekin says, any pointers though? Well, I mean, I think the first one that you can do, and I'm sure because all of these other conversations about what you can win, and why having a union is important, I think one of the things that is a real advantage that organizers within Starbucks have right now is to point to, the fact that it's winning. Right, you're not the first people who have to sort of step out there. You're part of like this big movement that's happening. There's a lot of momentum. Um, and two, look at how Starbucks is reacting to this union push. They're already coming to the bargaining table to some extent. They're doing a scorched earth campaign to try to stifle any more unions from developing within Starbucks. But if you look at the kind of public statements that have come out from Starbucks saying, well, we're going to offer this or we're going to offer that, that's proving to people that no, our collective power gets the goods. If they're already willing to put this on the table, imagine what they're going to be willing to put on the table if we get, 50, 60, 70% unionization across the country, in Starbucks. I mean, I'm sure that your girlfriend is getting great advice from people who know far more than me about how to organize successful campaigns. But if I were in the room, that would be something that I would highlight, on top of the kind of basic pitch for a union. And Strom is talking about social media free speech stuff. Says, I called out Madeline Albright for being a war criminal and an MLM, multi-level marketing ghoul, on TikTok, and my video got taken down for containing hate speech. Yeah, this is always funny, how quickly they are to protect the rich and powerful against hate speech. I mean, we're talking about in the UK, they wouldn't let the Tribune magazine put up an article because it was discriminatory against landlords. Lord in heaven. Dave Connor says, David, I'm a Teamster in a right to work state, and the union presence in my warehouse doesn't seem to be very powerful. Any advice for organizing to increase it? I mean, I don't know how your union is set up, but I think that, one thing, especially in more established unions, that is necessary, is trying to get involved internally, to making sure that the top of the union is standing up in material ways for the vast majority of people. We're seeing in states like Texas, and maybe we'll talk about this a little bit later, but in Beaumont, Texas, the U.S. steel workers there, they faced a 10-month lockout, from ExxonMobil there, and they were trying to negotiate a better contract, and the contract that they accepted was not a very good one, and there was a huge campaign to decertify. And that seems to be a strategy in a lot of these more right wing or right to work states, is that there's a big push to decertify. So the only advice that I could give you as an outsider would be to try to get as involved internally within the union and what it's doing, what it's negotiating, um, because there's a big push right now to basically make unions take bad deals, and then to use those deals as an excuse to the general membership as to why you should decertify and start negotiating as an individual. A server dislike says, how do existing leftist projects, CPA, DSA, IWW, SRA, and similar accelerate labor militancy? Well, that's up to the projects themselves. I mean, I think some of the more exciting things that have been happening in DSA has been, a push to increase labor leadership within the organization, and to continue to build out that side of the organization to really embed itself within the labor movement. So one of those things is like it's sort of up to the organization, to decide how it can do that. And I think if you're a member of particularly the DSA, that has to be a first and foremost position, that like we really need to be expanding unions, and working to increase labor militancy across the board, but particularly amongst organized labor, because you're seeing a lot of things that were sort of thought to be impossible or from an old era, really bubbling up again when it comes to the appetite in this country amongst working people, to start to stand up and push back against the kind of dictatorship of the bosses. And I think going back to the memeing of different kind of concepts, Cameron Robson has a good point. He says easily digestible could mean different things. I don't think these specific examples should be that hard to explain to people. You shouldn't need to reduce it down to a meme. I agree. I mean, I highly suggest, not to pimp out my own work too much, but the video I did for Jacobin, talking about political theories for everybody, really relies on some incredible footage of Fred Hampton, in a meeting of the Black Panthers, where he really pushes back against, another comrade and member of the organization who put forward a whole policy proposal for public banking, but didn't include like the political education section. And Fred Hampton makes a phenomenal point there, where it's like if people don't understand why we set up, this institution in that example, like a public bank, right? And what's the point of the public bank? The public bank, particularly if you imagine the racial and social context of that time, is to allow working people and Black people access to finance without having to pay the criminal rates that they were sort of being faced with in the more traditional banking sector. And for people to, and then if you're to establish something like that, you need people to understand that like this is something that's collective, that is for all of us, and is something that's beneficial to you, and it's beneficial to your neighbors, it's beneficial to your cousins, right? It's beneficial to your family, because if you don't have that kind of understanding, then people might just see money and want to, find ways to use it. I mean, Fred Hampton says, you'll just start to see people stealing from the organization if they don't understand what it means. If they just see that it's money, you can really hamper yourself. And I think, we always have to have that kind of long form understanding of what we're doing, even if it might not seem immediate right now. People need to understand why we're promoting the things that we're promoting, so that if we ever, if they ever do come into place, that we don't undermine them from the inside, because unfortunately, that's something that happens time and time again, throughout the left. Hmm. Kowalski's here. I always love when I share these here. Thanks for the super chat, brother. I always love when we share the super chat that it gives us the text version. Um, Derek says, David, do you know if they could expand veterans hospitals to more former military service members? I mean, it's an interesting question. I'm not really an expert, in how those how those systems work. So I don't really have an answer for you, but it's definitely something interesting to think about. I think this is going back to uh, the AOC Chris Smalls thing. Marcus says, can we focus on the win instead of people running into their corners, so to speak? Will there ever be solidarity within the left? And can we be taken seriously? We need to build with momentum. 100% agree with you on the second bit. But I would also say that, if somebody says something that it's worthwhile taking them at the word and listening to what they're saying. I don't think that, ignoring that comment necessarily is worthwhile. I do think that people overfocus on it because they're trying to use it for their own kind of proxy battles. And as I said earlier, I think that we can understand that some people might want to use, Chris Small saying that AOC didn't show up and it's not her victory, cynically to promote their own kind of projects, which again didn't really do much either. You can understand some people are using it cynically without saying we're going to ignore this very, very fair criticism of people who are supposed to be, the leaders, at the vanguard of this movement. And I think that, AOC sort of operates under her own logic, which oftentimes is separate, I think, from the broader and growing left wing movement, which is again very, very small and isolated. Even within her own district, right? I think that we can understand all those things without saying, "Oh, we're not going to address this or interact with that at all." I think that's also a big mistake, too, because that's like the other side of the people who are cynically using. I think cynically ignoring it because you think it might help out some people who you might not like. I think that's how you really get yourself into a lot of trouble, and I don't think it's very healthy for the left in general to sort of filter everything that you see happen in the broader movement out in public into these kind of inter squabbles. Again, not even between movements, but in between different media spheres. I find that stuff to be extremely toxic and unhelpful in general. AOC should have shown your support, but on the other hand, I have to give her some leeway in using her own strategy when the left is divided. And I wonder if she thought saying something could hurt the vote. Well, I don't know if that would be fair. I mean, she's an extremely popular and well known politician. I don't think her showing up would have hurt that project. She showed up. She's shown up at a lot of strikes in the area. I mean, it's not like she doesn't show up for anything. I think that I mean, as Chris said later in another interview, I can't remember if it was on MSNBC or Bloomberg or one of the other ones that he did, that he thinks that a lot of the people didn't show up because they didn't believe in them, right? And that's a problem. But it also, I think, shows where he's coming from too, saying like, this. He said something along the lines. We're going to play this. We're going to talk about this more tomorrow during the show with Matt. But he said something along the lines, this is a marathon, not a sprint, so there's plenty of time to redeem yourself. So I think that he's being actually quite fair-minded with all of this. And I mean, the story there is that she was supposed to show up to an event and then cited security concerns. I didn't show up, and then a couple weeks later, with the dress thing. I think that it was an unfortunate absence on her part, especially for somebody who has, in other contexts, been very, very willing to come at Amazon. I mean, she was one of the people who pushed against Amazon building their second headquarters there as well. She also said something along the lines of, that district, the warehouse not being in her district. And as Chris Smalls responded to her, he said, plenty of people who work at that facility live in your district. So sort of compartmentalizing things like that is unhelpful. And, she's willing to come here. I think it's not unreasonable to expect her to show up to things like that. I mean, I don't think that it's an unreasonable ask for somebody who's saying that we need to be organizing and doing the things that she talks about to show up to something like that. I think that the criticism's been fair, and I think that Chris, as he's been asked about it multiple times now, I think has also been very, very fair too. And as Steve said, you're hoping for solidarity with leftists. Don't hold your breath. Nobody's pure enough. Yeah, and the funny thing is, what's pure to you versus somebody else is always very, very different things. I'm scrolling back down Damn, I'm a little bit behind y'all, about 10 minutes. I'm just making my way through these questions. I always These are great when I get y'all a lot of questions like this. I appreciate it, and I think these are more fun than just me coming at y'all, since we do that for the main show. Let's see. No, I think public banking is something that we absolutely need. Amanda from Facebook, it's good to see you. Said we need a public option banking to compete against the big banks too, and like not only to compete against the big banks, but to like if you want to read like finance, the control over finance is a private power that capitalists have over American society at large, right? If they're the people who have the money, we either have to get money from them through taxes or through trying to direct private investment into things. And this is the neoliberal model, right? Is that you try to direct investment into avenues of society that you want, through tax breaks or things like that. And, that's an incredible amount of power because it only increases. I don't know if people are familiar with this term, but it increases the ability of capitalists to do what's called a capital strike, where they actually decide to disinvest or to not invest in certain areas if it doesn't sort of help out their bottom line. And they can get tremendous amounts of concessions from the government and from society at large through this power. Taking away that power to finance things from private capitalists is a very, very important goal that all socialists should have. And, public banking is something that we have a lot of allies on, progressives in general, MMT people really like public banking as well. And that's a coalition that is an immediate win that we could have that could really reshape the kind of power balance in society, particularly for like state and local governments, which are so underfunded. You see here, and you know, the Bitcoin thing is an unfortunate example of how underfunded cities are. Why are so many mayors looking toward to this, Ponzi scheme, to potentially fund things? Or, there's a small town in Texas somewhere near Dallas. I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head right now. That they basically, to pay off their debt, they took a deal, devil's bargain, with this kind of Bitcoin mining firm that took up a former coal plant in the area, and they promised to pay off the city's debt in response to that. And now, the city has a threat of having this kind of private, extreme demand on their energy system. And as people know in Texas, that's something that's very much under threat. And cities are sort of forced into that relationship because they're so underfunded. And being able to have access to state or like local public banking for cities could be incredibly beneficial for us to start to promote projects like public transportation, affordable housing, and things like that, without having to rely on very, very low state budgets. And then, states like Texas, hostile state budgets to most cities, um, or having to convince, a large group of capitalists basically to fund things in your community. That should be something that the people should be able to decide. And, promoting public banking is a very, very direct way that we can do this. I think Amanda has a follow up too, saying we need to govern ourselves. If government and the people keep passing the buck, a capitalist will be there, capitalize on it, and put it in his pocket. There isn't a public good that profiteers don't see as a potential revenue stream, schooling, prisons, etc. I think that's a phenomenal point. And public banking is just a very immediate way that we can start to build alternatives. This is from Twitch. Red Wizard says social media and talking heads take advantage for clicks, but as a W and the criticisms are real. So let's learn from this and accept the win. I think that's generally my position. Um, all right. Is it Denton, Texas, where the Bitcoin mine was? I'm sorry, I hadn't. It's been a little while since I read the longer piece on it. I'm just going to read this because Sean's been noting this, but the dollar will soon lose its status as the world's reserve currency at a time when debt of all kinds are at record levels. Simultaneously, farming input costs are exploding. Food inflation explodes. I mean, what's going on in food, and particularly wheat, should worry everybody. It definitely looks like food prices are going to increase in the next 6 months, and that's extremely devastating. Particularly to working class people's pocketbooks. I don't think that it's incorrect to see the U.S. dollar losing some of its status as a world reserve currency, particularly that's been aggravated, obviously, by Russia's barbaric invasion of Ukraine. But um, I think the kind of early calls that the U.S. dollar as a world reserve currency um, is on its deathbed, I think are a little premature. I think that it's without a doubt that things are trending in that direction, but I don't see that system definitely shifting in the next 5, 10 years. I mean, obviously it's hard to predict the future. Who knows what will be coming? I mean, we couldn't have seen something like COVID before it happened. Um, unless you're really studying that kind of stuff. So I could, of course, be wrong, but I think, the left has been saying that, the system is on its deathbed for almost 200 years. I think it's worthwhile to understand that it's incredibly dynamic, and also that, you have a lot of responsibilities that come with being the world reserve currency, a hell of a lot of benefit. But, China, is who people usually attribute when people make the argument that the dollar is going to lose its kind of power as the global currency. They look at China, and China has been making some moves in it, but it's very, very clear that China does not want to dethrone the US because it really restricts your ability to do internal macro policy if you have to sort of maintain a kind of stability in your currency. Something that I don't think China is really wanting to do right now in their current um, in their current development. So I think you need to understand that too, instead of just I think people are very quick to, especially socialists, are very quick to start calling that things are about to collapse, and I think that that's can be a big mistake. There are tremendous amounts of contradictions, and as they have to move things around to sort of avoid these kind of major collapses that very much could potentially happen. But one thing that we've learned from the financial crisis onward is that capital has been quite um, willing and fluid and dynamic in its attempts to sort of put down the kind of internal contradictions of the system. So it doesn't mean that those tensions aren't there, but the kind of inevitability, I think that some people make these arguments, can be a bit mistaken. All right, let's see. All right. Well, I'd be happy to take a couple more questions. I have to run to talk to Walls in a second. Maybe I'll play this clip for y'all, and then we could I'll maybe take a couple more questions before we roll. I don't think I got to get to the what I had in mind with the title, um, but maybe this is I'll do a teaser on it for another stream. But we had a conversation. We were on This Is Revolution over the weekend. You can find it on our YouTube channel or on theirs. You should definitely subscribe to all the guys there. Gene, Pascal, Jason, and Marcus do incredible work. But we were talking a little bit, and we were talking about policing, and we were making the point that the police function in this society to basically try to using brutal tactics try to iron out not contradictions, but very serious social tensions in society, right? And it's not a solution in the sense of an ethical one, but cities are very, very willing to just sort of beef up their police budgets to send the police in to harass and attack poor and working class people. And there's no doubt that as inequality rises, these tensions will get worse, and the reliance of the state on the kind of more forceful tools that it has will increase. Um, but Pascal was making the point that, and it's a point that a lot of the leftists make, which is that we had this period of time from like the 50s to 70s in the U.S., which some people sort of consider to be the golden era of labor, in the sense of like that was a time when some form of the middle class dream was in reach for working people, because you could work a kind of blue collar job and still have enough, so that you could have only one parent working. You could go on vacation. You could own your own house. You could own a car, maybe two. And that's very true in the sense that there were some people who were brought into that kind of class matrix. I think it's important not to misremember it. It wasn't overwhelmingly true that was the case. And there's no doubt that there is a shift in the 70s. Um, but I think that it's really important that we not see this shift as something that was collectively felt across the board. In more ways than one, what you saw from the 70s onward was the victory of a certain group of capital, of the capitalist class, particularly financial capital, become dominant. And you can see this from the incorporation of working people into the financial system at large. Very, very small slice of the pie. But you saw some people through pensions, through an increasingly financialized housing market, becoming more and more in touch with the health of the American financial system, so that they had an interest. It was a much smaller interest than rich people, but they had some interest in making sure that the system didn't collapse, right? And there was a very, very clever move in the society, because it created a class of working and middle class people who were sort of plugged in. Again, they were getting a very small cut of the pie, but they were cut into the pie. But financial capital really starts to dominate industrial capital in the United States, and that was a very, very big shift in the way that this system started to develop and shift there. And there's a lot of examples of this, but I think most notably is the shift between the executive suite of corporations and the financial sector of corporations. So the kind of fixation from CEOs with the stock price of their company versus output or profit or sales. That's a shift that had tremendous effect on the way that these companies were governed. You're even starting to see it now with Howard Schultz saying that the CEO of Starbucks, who's returned, saying that they're going to, invest more, in operations instead of in, stock buybacks, and basically trying to inflate the company's stock price, right? And they're seeing that because they're worried about the, labor unrest within the company. But you see that there's a kind of detachment from the way that a lot of these organizations think about their corporations, right? And for them, it's much more about how they're financialized and how their stock price is doing than even what is happening on the ground. Tesla is a phenomenal example of this. I mean, when people actually look at the books there, it's a company that produces very, very little, despite being incredibly valued as a corporation. And there's a disconnect there between like the actual real production of that company and the financial side of the company, the financialized side of the company. And the true believers will say, well, it's a promise. It's a promise about the future, that they believe that 15 years down the line that this company is going to be able to to produce and to reach its evaluation. And we'll let the record show, I guess, how true that tends to be. But you see a company that its stock price falls and rises based on the tweets and antics of its CEO. You can't really have a lot of confidence on the ground business there. And that shift really, really fundamentally changed American capitalism. And so that's a little teaser for what I want to get to. I might have to do that in the future, um, but I think it's very important. Sean has a kind of follow up to this. Says David, in the early 80s, the Fed fought inflation by massively raising interest rates. Are there economic factors at work today that systematically prohibit such actions? Yes. The over financialization of the economy, really more than anything right now, is predicated on extremely low interest rates. And that's why you see capital sort of sprinting towards the most speculative parts of the economy. I mean, the Bitcoin stuff, the NFT stuff is funny. And all, but like the reason that people are so willing to play, I'm not talking about small players, people who get duped into thinking that this is their kind of ticket out of wage labor. Um, you see that there's a group of people who have tremendous amounts of cash and they don't want to hold that cash. They want to put into assets that they think are going to appreciate in value dramatically. And the reason is because while interest rates are low, there's not as much incentive to sort of hold cash, right? You want to hold assets instead. And this is a kind of global phenomenon now that is produced by the Federal Reserve and its historically low interest rates. Um, you know, understanding that doesn't necessarily mean that a huge increase in interest rates would be good for us. Unfortunately, we're on this nasty boat with these people, and if the financial system starts to collapse, the first people who get hit when belts tighten are working people. Um, so there is a bit of a pickle, but there's no way. You have to understand, the kind of speculative nature of capital. That we've seen, particularly since the financial crisis, but even um, you know, after the kind of internet bubble in the 90s, early 2000s, is certainly an outgrowth of capitalists not being able to get as much return on their investment in more traditional investments, and a need to sort of rely on financial products and financialization as a kind of system, as an ideology. Um, yeah, there's no doubt that those things are connected in my mind. And not only um, did those interest rates affect working people in the 80s, right? But they also played a big role in the kind of move from in the kind of victory of financial capital over industrial capital. Also has to be noted too, that as those interest rates rose in the 80s, it was countries, other countries, developing countries that had U.S. debt, who also got trapped in this really horrific and devastating debt crisis that most of those countries have not been able to climb out of that either. Um, Somebody had a oh, here we go. The Anti-Corporatist has a book suggestion. I'm not familiar with this. You definitely, David, you should definitely check out the Anna Callahan thing. She's all about strategy to elect progressive slave candidates and support them. Sounds interesting. I'm not familiar with who that is or their work, but I'll keep my eye out for it. Send it my way too. People know how to reach me by email or send me a DM on Twitter. Probably the best way. Yeah, and as AB says, they can't raise the rates too much without crashing the whole show, and that's the kind of weird position that we're in right now. I mean, I have to be really careful that people don't misunderstand me when I say that, like, the weird consequences of extreme wealth that we see around us is undoubtedly like a response and a reaction, not a reaction, is the result of these, of what is called like cheap money, right? These really, really low interest rates. And so I think you have to understand that is a major player in the way that capital is developing, while also understanding that a huge increase in interest rates would be absolutely devastating for most of us. No doubt about that. um, and that's the perverse nature of this. As Sune says, if interest rates go up, people debt, in essence, poor people will suffer the most. That's the cruel thing, about this entire system, is that they lock the rest of us into a system that really, really benefits them. It just puts us at increased risk. All right. I'm going to have to run because because we're going to talk to Waz. So Big Waz will be joining us on the show tomorrow. Let me see. Oh shoot, it's almost 6. I gotta run. I'm sorry. I wish I could sit and chat. Maybe before we leave, I want to share one thing. Hey James, one asked about the AOC thing. Yeah, we talked about it at the beginning of the show. You can check that. Matt and I are gonna talk about it a little bit tomorrow, too. More about the organizing than that kind of stuff. But keep your eye out for this. I wanted to share this in closing. I only have a minute afterwards, but this is Ted Cruz, and we're very critical of the kind of issues with the American system and the American state. But when it comes to law, there are some provisions in there that have never been lived up to, but are absolutely crucial for building a different kind of society, a different kind of world. And I think it's really important for us, not to fall into a kind of blind praise of these systems, but to understand exactly what they are threatening when they talk like this. This is Ted Cruz. He's talking mainly in the capacity of, the Supreme Court nomination. I'm not particularly interested in that right now. People know my position on the Supreme Court, or should, if not, check it out. And but this is Ted Cruz talking about public defenders, and it is something that should really worry you. What the right wing is trying to do here, because it truly is a threat to working people. But I'll shut up and let y'all see this real quick.
She came out of law school and she clerked for Justice Breyer on the Supreme Court, and she became a federal public defender. And you and I have both known public defenders, and there are public defenders, people go and do that because their heart is with criminal defendants. Their heart is with the murderers, with the criminals, and that's who they're rooting for. A lot of the same reason people go become a prosecutor, because they want to lock up bad guys. Public defenders often have a natural inclination in the direction of the criminal. And I got to say, that inclination was not just while she was a public defender, but she carried it onto the bench. When she became a criminal judge.
Absolutely disgusting comments here. And again, I'm not saying not to worry or care about the political ramifications of the spin that he's trying to put on that. But you cannot say that you believe in democracy. You cannot say that you believe in rule of law if you do not believe that every single person who faces our justice system has the right to adequate representation. In fact, in this country, poor people, even who are within the public defense system, face massive rates of plea deals and incarceration because the public defense system in this country is broken. It is underfunded. And the good people who try to do that work to make sure that everybody can get a fair hearing in court are up against the wall. You have people across the country who they have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of cases because public defense is so underfunded in this country. If you want to make money after law school, and the expense that goes in that that goes into that is immense. If you want to make money after law school, you don't go into public defense because there's very, very little money in that. In fact, most people commentating and journalists out there probably are making more money than a public defender is without having the requirement of a very, very expensive law school degree. Public defense is not about saying your heart is with the criminals. Your heart is with the idea that every person should be equal before the law. And this system and the American history has been a far cry from that kind of ideal. But watching this kind of right-wing attack on public defense should absolutely make you sick. You don't have to agree with me on everything. You don't have to be a socialist or a radical to think that if you want to live in a free society, that the amount of money that is in your bank account should not decide whether or not you go to prison. And that is what the current state of affairs is. Ted Cruz saying that going into prosecution is about having your heart with law and order is such bullshit. For the most part, people who go into prosecution after law school are people who are searching for the most lucrative paychecks. You're going to get a hell of a lot more money as a prosecutor than you will certainly as a public defender. These are these kind of wedge issues in this system that I think socialists should really insert ourselves in because it shows both the kind of promise that most people are brought up with in this country of a kind of fair justice system for all, and the reality. that money rules this society. Money gives you access to high quality lawyers, and money can buy you out of prison, even if you are somebody who's very, very likely guilty. While poor people have to plea. So that they and plead guilty to crimes they didn't even commit, because they know that the book will be thrown at them if they have the audacity to try to stand up for themselves and for justice. And I don't know. I think that this is a kind of political wedge that can be used to show both a potential promise of democracy and just how far off it is, and certainly a great way to come at little nasty, skeevy people like Ted Cruz. Yeah, I have to run. Waz and our friend Matt are waiting for me. We're going to record our interview and we'll premiere that tomorrow on the show. We'll be talking about Starbucks and Amazon a bit more, and probably a couple more stories. Be sure to show up. Join us at patreon.com/leftreckoning. You get access to all the bonus episodes. You get access to the post games where we're taking voicemails now, and a hell of a lot more. I'll see y'all tomorrow afternoon. Take care.